production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
How public art reshapes Memphis. Tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, publisher of the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for joining us. I'm joined tonight by Lauren Kennedy, Executive Director of the Urban Art Commission. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Along with Karen Golightly, Director of Paint Memphis. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me too.
And Bill Dries, Senior Reporter with the Memphis Daily News. So I'll start with you, Lauren, and just why public art? Why is it important? Why does it matter? And we'll get into why sometimes it's controversial, but why is it important?
Sure. I think one of the best ways I've heard it described, Theaster Gates gave a TED Talk and talked about how beauty is a basic service. And I think that gets at the heart of why public art matters. Somebody's experience moving through the world matters, and walking through or accessing a cared for space, some place that's been really considered and aesthetically pleasing it just really changes the way that you're navigating it. And so I think that the investment in our collective experience in that way is what matters the most to me, as well as this idea that art doesn't have to be in these rarefied spaces, not in museums where you have to navigate marbled entryways or galleries where if you don't come from a place where you've accessed that before, it can be very intimidating. It's not very welcoming sometimes for people who haven't experienced that before.
And for you, why public art?
Well, it's the same thing. I mean, it's something that should be a part of our basic lives. And for Paint Memphis, it's really sort of an idea that it can be accessible anywhere to anybody, regardless of their socioeconomic class or even like their geography or whether they have transportation to a center for art, they can actually access it.
And let's talk a little bit about your organizations. You're the newer one of what, right. 2015 Paint Memphis. Yes. You founded Paint Memphis.
Yes.
What is Paint Memphis? How is it funded? Tell us what it is.
So Paint Memphis is a 501c3, and we are funded by grants, federal and state grants, as well as by individual donors and corporate business sponsors, organization sponsors in general. And so essentially we founded it because I'm a photographer, and so I'd taken pictures all over the U.S. of public art, weirdly, but and I came back to Memphis and there was so little. I mean, this was 7 years ago. There was so little here, and especially something along the lines of graffiti or more street art oriented, you would have to go into a ditch or a building, an abandoned building, or places where people couldn't see these beautiful things that had been created by people. So I wanted to make some of that accessible, and I wanted to sort of change the idea that graffiti equals blight and show that actually street art and graffiti could be a sign of development and community development and beauty.
And how many, give or take, how many projects have you done?
We just do one annually, so this is we just completed our third project.
Which was describe the one that was just done.
It was at Willette and Lamar, and it's 33,000 square feet of art.
Okay, and we'll come back to that, and we have some photos of some of the art there. For Urban Art Commission, what you all were founded in the 90s. Give us, what is Urban Art Commission then and now?
Yeah, so we were founded in 1997, and especially in those early days and for the longest part of our 20-year history now, it was initially about passing the Percent for Art program, which is a model used across the country, developed in the late 50s, early 60s in Pittsburgh, I believe was the first one, where a city annually allocates money from their capital budget each year for public art. So where the city is spending other capital dollars, like renovating a park or building a new police station, we have the ability to attach additional dollars just for the development of public art there. In the last 3 years, though, we've tried to expand what we're doing through new partnerships, more grant-funded activities, more private businesses, because we are a nonprofit that we contract annually with the city, so we have the ability to work beyond that Percent for Art program, and that's not only in identifying new revenue streams, which means new project opportunities for artists. It also gives us some flexibility in terms of what we're producing beyond like traditional sculpture or mural, which historically has been the bulk of what we've done.
All right, we'll go to Bill.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about what happens when art intersects with government, public art in particular. Do these two worlds coming together, are there natural points at which they conflict, or should there be points where they conflict? Why is the discussion so rough at times, do you think?
I think there are a few things playing into it. One, I think art tends to be kind of this thing that's tucked on the side, right? One, it's often considered frivolous, where there are other budgetary demands. If you haven't, again, had that experience growing up, going to a museum or accessing art classes in school or something, it can be a big unknown, and it makes people uncomfortable talking about it if they feel like they don't know kind of some of the history or what the language is to use around it. I think it's also very subjective, and I think kind of the conflation of all of that is often what creates some of this tension that we're talking about. I don't think it always has to be that way, and I think some of the cities that Memphis and other places look to is that there's something happening here that we would like to emulate or see happen in our city. Those are often cities where they've really put some power and energy behind their creative fields, and that those cities are places where creative people want to be, where there's opportunities for them there, and that where it's been made a priority. Mm-hmm. So I'm hopeful that that's something that we're able to do here.
Mm-hmm. Karen, in your case, because Paint Memphis has been in the news a lot recently for some of the murals. Your impression of this intersection of art and government and the funding that's involved in it, does it have to be this controversial? Should it be this controversial?
I don't think it should at all. We have had a great experience working with the mayor's office, and it's been more of a partnership. It's not been funded, so I think maybe there's some differences there between our two organizations. But and it took a long time. I mean, I visited other cities and I kept showing them what other cities were doing. And a lot of it was sponsored by the government and some of it wasn't, but I kept showing them the power of transformation of public art, and specifically murals, and how easy it was to transform a city or a neighborhood or even some place just through paint. And they were really open to it and started talking to me, and they entertained the idea at least. And finally, they granted us the very first permission wall, city-sanctioned permission wall that exists in Memphis, and that means that it's legal to go paint there. Anyone can go paint there, and it's city property, which has not been the case ever in Memphis. So there's a lot of movement. I mean, we're slow, I think, but I think we're moving forward.
Where is that?
That's at Chelsea and Evergreen.
Okay.
Yeah.
And back. Oh, go ahead, Lauren.
Well, I was just going to add that. I think that that's an important point that Karen's bringing up, right? That when I'm having conversations with city officials, most often it's not that they're balking at the idea that art is important. That's not really, I think, a case statement so much. I think that that's pretty easy for people to accept. But I think when you get into some of the processes and how things come to develop and how they come to be executed, that's where things get trickier, and especially for us more so, right? Because, there's a huge chunk of our money that is coming from the city.
Well, yeah, but because the question comes up, okay, is there local input on this? And at the same time, you're working with artists who in order for their work to succeed, in order for their work to make a point, they certainly have to have some control over what they're doing. My impression is that art by committee really doesn't work very well if it's all done by committee.
Well, it's tricky because if you have one body of people controlling art for an entire city or state or country, that certainly gets to be probably less effective in terms of letting creativity flow from the artist. So our solution to that was to set up some guidelines that the city agreed on and that all of our artists agreed to adhere to. And that was sort of, that's how we went with it. That content-wise, we established a theme and set up guidelines for things like profanity and gang imagery or drug imagery or nudity. And those were sort of how we went with it. And the city, you know, they agreed to that, and that's how we did that.
For the people who haven't followed, the criticism your group has gotten, and we had the Spagnola kind of zombie mural up a moment ago, was really from the council. And so one council member, I think it was Robinson, had heard from some neighbors that didn't like it. Others were just kind of swearing. Excuse me. Thank you. The council, I mean, and you as well, UrbanArt, and there was a lot of controversy this summer about whether, you know, what you were doing, what were you going to be funded, was enough of the money that was coming from the city going to local artists. That conversation is hard to have with council members, or is it just part of the process, as Bill was saying?
Well, it's difficult because I don't think that the city council necessarily, in the case of Paint Memphis, understands the process or has been educated on the process. I mean, hopefully they will be. And so I don't think, and also neighbors, not everybody, you see a mural go up, but you have no idea really how it got there or who did it. And so I just think that there's a lot of even community education that can happen so that everybody can be informed of the process and can understand the relationship with the government and with neighborhoods and with other organizations and businesses as well.
And in terms of that process, do neighbors get notified? I mean, is there public input? I mean, if you're putting up a restaurant or a hotel, there's some amount of notice that goes into that area that says, hey, come to a meeting, come wherever, have some input. Generally, there hasn't always been. Is that the case with these murals?
Well, we did for the first 2 years. In fact, we did, and we were over on Chelsea and Evergreen, and we did neighborhood surveys and public meetings, and like 30 people came. And they didn't, I mean, because art is not, that's not a neighborhood where public art exists at all, is where we were. And they didn't really know what to ask for. They did help us set up the guidelines. I mean, they knew they did not want gang imagery on that neighborhood wall, and they knew they didn't want drug imagery or nudity. And so they really helped us to set that up. And they thought of some of those ideas, but specific images, no one ever said, don't put a zombie on our wall.
And to be fair, Ryan Poe in the Commercial Appeal did a story on this, and he interviewed some neighbors and passersby who most of them really liked it. You know, so again, it gets back to that subjectivity.
Right.
For you and UrbanArt, which does how much? A couple questions. How much of your funding does come from the city? What percent, give or take?
Well, for our project funds, probably 60 to 70%, depending on the year. It's roughly like $350,000 a year in terms of project funds that come to us from the city. And then we're growing beyond that. And we do have a more established process for neighborhood input, which, to your point about art by committee, it can be tough, and I've seen it. I've seen it knock some artists around more than others, because I think that there are some artists who are adept at it and some that are not, in terms of hearing that feedback and figuring out a way to stay true to their creative practice, but then also taking into account what the neighbors are saying. And I don't think it's necessarily that they need to know what kind of images they want to see. I think it's just having a conversation with them about what's important in their neighborhood, what's going on in their neighborhood. And I think that's really, really important. I think, especially if you're talking about a residential area, I think there does need to be a conversation with people who are going to be most directly impacted by that work. And it's not easy, it's often messy, but it's an important piece.
Yeah, Bill.
So in the case of the Urban Art Commission, as I understand what the council is considering, there would be some new guidelines for the selection committee. And is there a selection committee for each individual project that you have?
There is a selection committee for each project, but then actually what the council is looking at shifting is the details around the Public Art Oversight Committee. So there's an appointed body where the council and the mayor and then Urban Art Commission collectively appoint members to the Public Art Oversight Committee, and they oversee every approval for any city-funded project, whereas a selection committee is specific to that project. So it's the Public Art Oversight Committee that council is going to have a greater hand in identifying those members, asking for quarterly reports back to council. Some things that are ultimately, it's I think it's good, to Karen's point, to have this greater level of education about the process, and for council to be able to be a little bit more intimately connected to that. And I hope that that helps in the future where questions arise where there's a little bit more understanding.
And one of the questions was, and if you said this, I apologize, about local artists and how it's local money, local tax money, and I think from some council members' point of view, all of it should go to Memphis artists. What is your perspective on that, of how much of that Memphis tax money should be spent with Memphis artists, and how much is right now?
Sure. So we, since the beginning of the Percent for Art program, there was a mandate that 60% of dollars or projects over a 5-year period were concentrated with local artists, and we met that mandate. But where I'll be transparent, right, is that there were bigger budget projects going to artists outside the city, and that was really where a lot of the heartburn came from. And I feel very much of two minds. I've never felt that this was an either-or proposition. I think it's a both-and. I think it's important to support artists living and working here, but I also think it's really important to be exposed to artists making work in other cities and other places, for them to have a good experience here, for them to spend time with our artist community. I think that's that exchange is really important. And over the summer I talked a lot about how there aren't a ton of artists making public art, and I think people took that, and what they heard was that I was maybe saying that there weren't artists in the city, that there wasn't talent here, and I think that I'd really like to be able to address that point, because that's not what I'm saying at all. There's a breadth of talent and creativity here, but the cross-section of those people that are consistently applying for public art projects or that are already making work large scale and outdoor gets quite small. So my point with council recently has been, the mandate has changed now with the changes that'll be official December 19th. 60% of dollars each year are allocated specifically for local artists. But what I was trying to explain was that mandate won't just mean that there are more local artists winning commissions. We've got a lot of work as a team to do to help artists understand the process better, the submission process, what the life of a public art project is like. I mean, it's very different from a studio practice, and just really expanding the number and diversity and media of people that are applying for these projects.
Well, we've talked a lot about murals, but it's beyond that, right? I mean, it is sculptures. I mean, I think of the Bike Gate, which I don't think you all funded, but Bike Gate right at the end of what was that? Sam Cooper going into the park. I'm a member of the board of the Overland Park Conservancy. I always have to say that. But other projects in the Memphis Medical District, and one of the areas to me, just as totally a layperson in this, where I started noticing, whoa, there's a huge amount of public art was in Overton Square. And Bob Loeb, who Loeb Properties, put that project together with the city putting, a lot of money into the parking garage. He will joke that they had a budget for public art and then they exceeded it they went way beyond, but they just they loved it. They had this great sort of experience working with local artists and out-of-town artists, and that it kind of really, if you walk around Overton Square, it's a huge part of it, right? I mean, you don't have to have a degree in art, history to enjoy that and say that makes it, that's a part of the character of Overton Square, right? And that's public art in the sense that we're talking about it, right? Except privately funded in that case.
Right, and I've talked to Lewis Love about it quite a bit, and that was one of their intentions. It wasn't just to develop a commercial property, which they could have done with no art at all there, but they wanted to make it a place where people wanted to come and stay, not just come and eat and leave, but come and stay. Come during the day, not just a night spot, but really a place that would be much more welcoming and could showcase a lot of local talent and a lot of out-of-town talent as well. So.
Yeah, Bill.
Let's talk about the mural image that's kind of been at the center of the recent discussion on this. Some council members took the imagery as being a reflection on the struggle that the neighborhood there has had with crime and other issues like that. What do you say to that criticism, first of all?
Well, some people have interpreted that mural in different ways. Some people have interpreted it as a symbol of the devil, and some other people have interpreted it as, in fact, it's to be representative of a neighborhood or a community, or even all of Memphis, which has been oppressed, and now the roses symbolize, it's coming from the dead, and the roses symbolize the hope for the future. So I don't think that that is necessarily negative to the community. I think it is to show that there's a coming back, there's a rising up, and that even this neighborhood, which when we went into that area, it was filled with dead animals and dirty diapers and trash and boarded up and 25 different colors on the buildings. And we were very lucky that not only did the city let us do the underpass, but a private property owner was interested in us painting his building as well. And actually, it's almost an entire city block. So part of this is a private public government issue, but also just as far as the neighborhood goes, people interpret that different ways. And again, it's subjective. And I don't think that every single person is going to like every single mural there. I just don't think it's going to happen. But there are lots of different ones that can appeal to different people.
And what kind of input was there from the neighborhood specifically on that?
Well, we met with Roselle Ansdale, some representatives from them, and they did not want graffiti in the skateboard park, Altown. Mm-hmm. And that was one of their big things. They have seen graffiti as a negative thing there, even though the skateboarders love it. But they really saw it as negative, and so they said, can you put more traditional muralists? Because we do about half graffiti writers and half traditional muralists. And they said, could you put more traditional muralists in Altown? And I was like, okay, that's fine. I mean, it didn't matter. There's plenty of space there for everyone. And so we really got a lot of input this year from a lot of school groups and youth groups and muralists and all sorts of people who are all diverse in all different ways. I mean, some of it's age and some of it's their talent and skill and education and experience as far as making public art. And we sort of opened it up a lot this year to include all different kinds of groups. But we did honor their input in terms of moving the graffiti to the private building that was, and to the city part as well.
Mm-hmm. With just 4 or 5 minutes left here, you mentioned blight, and I'm curious how much of, I mean, I think about downtown and the, what was originally the demonstration block that the Center City Commission, now Downtown Memphis Commission did, and now they've done it up and down Main Street in those buildings that aren't developed, where they'll put a big mural on them. And if you live or work downtown, you see these murals are kind of tourist attractions now. It's very interesting. People come and take pictures with them, and they stand up against the butterfly, so they look like a butterfly. It's hard to describe, and it sounds silly, but you see tourists doing it all day long. How much of your work is specifically blight related, where it's, the Steric building downtown, which hasn't been occupied in decades, the ground floor is painted with some murals and so on to make it less of an eyesore. How much does urban art get into that?
I'd say we're still kind of newly dipping into that, mostly because a lot of that funding that we have administered in the past has been permanent projects. Those blight remediation efforts with public art are temporary, because the goal is that you're eventually renting that space and then something else happens. But actually with city funding, and we piloted it originally with a grant through Arts Memphis, have created a program where artists, it actually kind of flips the public art process on its head, and artists start by having 3 workshops with residents in the neighborhood to hear some things that they, learn some history about the neighborhood, understand what's going on, what the context is, and then also kind of some hopes and dreams. And the ideas that the artists come up with are based on those conversations, and then we take the ideas back to the people that participated.
I'm also struck by, and it's semi-blight, it's involved, everything we've talked about here is things like Downtown Memphis Commission right now, they're working in the Pinch and all the developments going up in the Pinch. A very high priority for them that they're spending a great deal of money on is lighting and painting the underpass. Mm-hmm. And if you're in Midtown or on Cooper Young, this painting of underpasses. I mean, as a layperson who drives by, that's great. I kind of like that. I wouldn't have thought to do that, but it sort of strikes you as pleasant. But they really see it as that's part of economic revitalization. Same with the medical district and the near Sun Studio, where they've done a bunch of public art. Define why that is, and this is a dumb question, this is a dumb Eric question. why is that? Why do I like that when I drive by? I mean, I would not ever envision that, but I go through the medical district now, and there's that bright, shiny blue thing over your head, and there's all this stuff. You suddenly enjoy that.
Well, I mean, it's just, you think about, it's I think helpful to have like a before and after shot, right? Because you think about, especially that underpass that DMC is doing now, and we're working with them on that. If you walk that underpass now, there's no
Why
feel
would you do
good.
that? It's scary.
Exactly.
I mean, you wouldn't want to go down there.
Exactly, and so that's cutting off the people that are, hanging out at the convention center from any businesses that are existing in the Pinch, right? There's just nothing welcoming or inviting or pleasant about that experience. But the project that Kong Wei Peng is going to create in there, people are going to go to the underpass to see this project. It creates an opportunity where you kind of catch your breath, right? It beautifies a space, which I think we kind of underrate the importance of that. And it just creates an attraction where there maybe wasn't one before, which has a positive impact on the businesses and people living around that, There's all of these conversations, right, about how public art can make a space feel safer. Like I've already said, make a space feel more cared for. And I think it does all of those things.
Yeah. Just with just a few seconds left, what you said you all do just one big event per year. Do you know where you're going to be next year?
We do not. So that will be, depend on what the city decides they want to do in terms of our partnership. But also, I just think it's really important that any sort of controversy about public art gets people to talk about public art. And so I'm glad this conversation exists.
All right. We will leave it there. Thank you both for being here. Thank you, Bill. And thank you for joining us. Join us again next week. Good night.
Intimidating. It's not very welcoming sometimes for people who are, haven't experienced that before.
And for you, why public art?
Well, it's the same thing. I mean, it's something that should be a part of our basic lives. And for Paint Memphis, it's really sort of an idea that it can be accessible anywhere to anybody, regardless of their socioeconomic class or even like their geography or whether they have transportation to a center for art, they can actually access it.
And let's talk a little bit about your organizations. You're the newer one of what, 2015 Paint Memphis.
Yes.
You founded Paint Memphis.
Yes. What
is Paint Memphis? How is it funded? Tell us what it is.
So Paint Memphis is a 501c3, and we are funded by grants, federal and state grants, as well as by individual donors and corporate business sponsors, organization sponsors in general. And so essentially we founded it because I'm a photographer, and so I'd take
Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
How public art reshapes Memphis, tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, publisher of the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for joining us. I'm joined tonight by Lauren Kennedy, Executive Director of the Urban Art Commission. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Along with Karen Golightly, Director of Paint Memphis. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me too.
And Bill Dries, Senior Reporter with the Memphis Daily News. So I'll start with you, Lauren, and just why public art? Why is it important? Why does it matter? And we'll get in
pictures all over the U.S. of public art, weirdly, but and I came back to Memphis and there was so little. I mean, this was, 7 years ago. There was so little here, and especially something along the lines of graffiti or more street art oriented, you would have to go into a ditch or a building, an abandoned building, or places where people couldn't see these beautiful things that had been created by people. So I wanted to make some of that accessible, and I wanted to sort of change the idea that graffiti equals blight and show that actually street art and graffiti could be a sign of development and community development and beauty.
And how many, give or take, how many projects have you done?
We just do one annually, so this is
Okay.
we just completed our third project.
Which was at, well, describe the one that was just done.
It was at Willette and Lamar, and it's 33,000 square feet of art.
Okay, and we'll come back to that, and we have into why sometimes it's controversial, but why is it important?
Sure. I think one of the best ways I've heard it described, Theaster Gates gave a TED Talk and talked about how beauty is a basic service. And I think that gets at the heart of why public art matters. Somebody's experience moving through the world matters, and walking through or accessing a cared for space, some place that's been really considered and aesthetically pleasing just really changes the way that you're navigating it. And so I think that the investment in our collective experience in that way is what matters the most to me, as well as this idea that art doesn't have to be in these rarefied spaces, not in museums where you have to navigate marbled entryways or galleries where if you don't come from a place where you've accessed that before, it can be very intimidating.
Some photos of some of the art there. For Urban Art Commission, what you all were founded in the 90s. Give us, what is Urban Art Commission then and now?
Yeah, so we were founded in 1997, and especially in those early days and for the longest part of our 20-year history now, it was initially about passing the Percent for Art program, which is a model used across the country, developed in the late 50s, early 60s in Pittsburgh, I believe was the first one, where a city annually allocates money from their capital budget each year for public art. So where the city is spending other capital dollars, like renovating a park or building a new police station, we have the ability to attach additional dollars just for the development of public art there. In the last 3 years, though, we've tried to expand what we're doing through new partnerships, more grant-funded activities, more private businesses, because we are a nonprofit that we contract